Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, another Friday 5 with some viewer questions. All right, let me just jump right into it with my first viewer question from Thomas Griffin. He says, I was wondering how I would check my own blades, especially samurai blades, for strength and purity. So there are a bunch of ways that this question can be answered, but the first thing to understand is that strength, the actual word that Thomas here used, strength is not really an engineering term, at least not in terms of steel. The most commonly used measurement of, kind of performance, at least potential performance capabilities of steel is what's known as Rockwell hardness, specifically the Rockwell C scale. So the way that Rockwell hardness works is you have a machine with a little diamond cone tip that is pushed into the whatever metal that you're testing to see how hard it is, and it just measures the distance that the probe pushes down into the material, and that yields a number. It's just a kind of random number, but typically hardened steel is in the general realm of 60 HRC. It might be down to 50 or up to up into the 60s, but that's kind of the general realm where it is. So that's one way that you can test your swords. Now, an important thing to understand is, and I should back up and mention that you can buy Rockwell hardness testing equipment. It's not super expensive. It's not cheap either, but for $1,000 or something, you can buy either a used American or cheap, cheaper Chinese model that will test Rockwell hardness. The thing to understand about Rockwell hardness, and I've got a whole video about that I'll link to here, but Rockwell hardness does not tell you everything you need to know about a particular piece of steel. The specific alloying of that steel makes a big difference. If you have vanadium or chromium or tungsten carbides, you may have higher wear resistance, which means better edge holding, but not necessarily, at least, higher hardness, and vice versa. Hardness correlates to brittleness, but one kind of steel heat treated a certain way may, at the same hardness, is not necessarily as brittle as another steel at that same hardness. A lot of nuances to this, but the bottom line is you can't just get some simple value, it's 60 Rockwell, and know everything you need to know about the performance characteristics of swords. So, a really important thing for beginning knife makers, once you've made a zillion knives, it's less important, but it's important when you're first making knives to test them. I mean, to abuse them, chop things up with them, bend them, break them, learn the performance envelope that you're dealing with a particular kind of heat treating regimen, with particular kinds of steel, whatever. And until you get a feel for that, just knowing, it's 60 Rockwell or something doesn't actually tell you all that much. And just by the way, there are other sort of engineering tests that you can do to measure, for instance, shock resistance. There's the Sharpie or Charpie test, the Izod test. And what these do is they use big heavy weights to smack a test sample and break it, and you see how much energy is required to make that fracture happen, and that yields you again a sort of a value that tells you, roughly speaking, how shock resistant that steel is. So I didn't mean to get too deep in the weeds on this, but the point is, very, very important when you get started making swords or knives to test them. It's great to know the Rockwell hardness. You can send them off to a good heat treating place, and they'll send them back and say, we got this to Rockwell 58 or whatever it might be. Nice to know that, but you really don't know the performance characteristics of that steel, how good the edge holding is, how shock resistant it is, how easily it bends and snaps back, and all those kinds of things. You won't know till you test it. And just to be 100% clear, what I mean by testing is not lab testing. There's value in that, but I'm talking about actual hands-on, real-world bending, breaking, smashing, all that sort of thing. So next question, and I don't even know the guy's name who did this. He didn't leave his name, but he said, I was thinking about making my own katana and was wondering if you had any tips or suggestions. So first thing, I don't want to make light of this question, and I'll tell you a story from my own experience as to why I'm not making fun of this. So my background that sort of led me into knife making came from martial arts, and I was very interested in Japanese swords. And so, knowing absolutely nothing about sword making, this was well over 20 years ago, I just thought, I'll just make a Japanese sword. I'll make a katana. And I got a book, and I projected on a screen on the wall one of these swords that I found in this book, traced it on a big piece of paper, cut it out, took it out, and I bought a piece of O1 steel, precision ground steel, and I laid it on the floor, and I traced around this little piece of paper, and then I used a jeweler's saw, which is the dumbest way you could possibly do this, to cut out the entire thing. That took me about 2 days. And then I filed the entire thing to shape, and that took me probably a week. And I got done with that, and I just had this sudden revelation just crash down on me, like I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing, and I need to go back and really learn some real stuff before I try to take on this thing. It's not an accident that Japanese swordsmiths have a 5-year apprenticeship before they're ever allowed to even, put their name on a sword. These are hard to make, and if you just want to launch, immediately into making Japanese swords, not an easy task. So, I don't know anything about the guy who asked this question. It could be that he's an experienced knife maker, and he just, he's been making knives for 1,000 years, and he, just wants to try this other thing. But it could be that he's a complete novice, never done anything of this type at all. So in either case, here's the path I would recommend that you go down if you're interested in making Japanese swords. Long story short, if you haven't made knives before, you really have to go back and kind of learn some preliminary stuff before you start trying to make a big, long Japanese sword. There's a reason why this is considered to be kind of the epitome of the blade maker's craft. It's because they're hard to make. And they're hard to make on a whole lot of different levels. So let me talk a little bit about what those levels might be. And so if you're coming at this, especially as an experienced knife maker, but you want to make a Japanese sword, here's some things that are worth thinking about as you kind of proceed into this complicated thicket. So the first thing that you have to address when you're making a Japanese sword is the geometry of the sword. The typical katana has a primary bevel, a secondary bevel, and then a tiny little bevel on the spine. But there are also ones that have just one single bevel and then a bevel on the spine. There are ones that kind of mix and match that as they move up the blade. And then the tip of the katana, if you have that double beveled, which is known as a shinogi zakuri style, the tip is set off with its own little special geometry. It's really important, if you're going to really try and make this in an authentic way, to understand exactly how that geometry works. So the more that you can get your hands on really high quality Japanese swords, or even, not super high quality, but reasonable quality swords, and actually look at them and see how that geometry works, the more that's going to help you out. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that I have a whole series of videos that I sell on my website, waltersorrellsblades.com, that, kind of delve into this and show a little bit about, how that geometry works. But it is kind of complicated, and you got to study that to figure it out. Otherwise, the tip and stuff will do wonky things, and you may think you're doing it right, but you're not. Next thing that's important to know when you're taking on the Japanese sword is to understand a little bit about the history. Now, I'm a Western guy. I didn't study in Japan. I didn't apprentice myself to a Japanese smith or anything like that. You can learn this stuff without, spending time over in Japan, but you do have to study. And so it's really important as you're taking on the Japanese sword to understand that there is this long history, really about 1,000 years of unbroken, handed down from father to son, master to apprentice wisdom about how these blades are made, what the geometry is, the heat treating, all that kind of stuff, and also how they're used. And the way that they're used, the way that they're mounted, it's all been, I would say, thought through, but it's developed over time in a very, very specific way, how you take them apart. And all of that has implications for the geometry of the Japanese sword. So the more that you study about the way that they're made, the geometry, the way that they're mounted, the handles and the scabbards and all that sort of thing, and the way that they're used, the better job that you'll do. And like I said, I came out of martial arts. I've got a fair amount of experience with the actual practical use of swords, and that really, really helped me out. So, I'm not saying, hey, you got to do all this stuff in order to make, a semi-decent Japanese sword. I'm just telling you, the more that you know, the better job you're going to do. Finally, and all good knife makers understand this, heat treating is absolutely the heart of good knife making. You can make something that looks pretty, it's nicely decorated, has all the apparent attributes of a nice blade that sucks, that's basically no better than a butter knife because it hasn't been heat treated properly. So the more that you understand about hamons and heat treating, the better job that you're going to do. What you're aiming to do, I should back up and mention this. The basic idea, the kind of the revelation that Japanese smiths had that made their swords a little bit different from swords made in other parts of the world was that they figured out a very specific strategy to cause a hard edge and a soft spine. And, that little wiggly line that is a part of that soft versus hard phenomenon is called a hamon. And, of course, lots of people who make modern Western kind of blades use those now. But the idea came out of Japan. So there's a whole rigmarole, a whole process of laying out the clay and water hardening it and all that sort of thing that produces that hamon. Important to understand, the hamon is only they look cool and that's nice, but it's a byproduct of an engineered solution to a problem. And here's the problem. A long blade that holds a good edge is going to be fairly brittle. And so when you're whacking a sword into an armored person or, a hard object, a tree or something like that, if the blade's entirely hardened, and hardened to keep a really hard edge, it's going to have a tendency to snap on you. You don't want that, especially when there's another guy trying to kill you. So the solution the Japanese came up with was this differential hardening, which produces a hamon. It's absolutely the heart of making Japanese swords. So the more you understand about heat treating and how to produce a hamon, the better the Japanese sword that you're going to produce in the end. All right, well, that wraps up today's viewer questions on this Friday 5. Next week, hopefully I'll be back with more actual projects, and you can watch me make a whole knife. Also, I should mention that in the near future, I'm going to be doing a whole series about belt grinders, attachments, basic things about how they work and so on. So keep an eye out for that. Should have one out in the next month or so. I meant to do it this past month and just didn't get around to it. This month just kind of disappeared from my life. But should have it soon. All right, guys, thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon. Keep making those knives. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe and make sure that you click on that bell so you get notified of all the latest videos. Want to buy a knife from me? Check out my modern blades at tacticsarmory.com. Digging the channel? You can support our video making efforts on Patreon. You know, I've been banging away on these videos for like 10 years, so I hope you'll show some love for all that hard work. Link in the cards and descriptions. Finally, if you're interested in making Japanese swords, check out my full line of Japanese sword videos where I show how to forge Japanese swords as well as how to polish them and how to make fittings, handles, and scabbards. WalterSorrellsBlades.com.